Hi, everyone. This is a continuation of our French Revolution series. We are about to enter the radical phase. We need to kind of set the stage here at the end of the liberal phase, but it's going to carry into the radical phase today. Here's just an example of a multiple choice question that you might see on an exam. Considering this individual cartoon, you then need to apply it to the different documents associated with the French Revolution. The liberal phase is continuing during this time. At this point, Louis is still at Versailles, and in Paris, in order to deal with some of these mobs dealing with the Day of the Tile and things like that, additional troops are called in from the border. One of the problems with that is those troops are, in many cases, Austrian in nature, doing nothing to quell the rumors that there's some sort of larger conspiracy between Marie Antoinette, her brother who currently sits on the Austrian throne, and the idea that the Habsburg lineage is going to continue here. Those troops are also stationed at Versailles. And so when we get to October 5th, the Women's March to Versailles, you get like 60 to 70,000 women who are traveling. It starts out, they're in Paris itself and they're getting together. And again, it's the no bread thing. Part of the reason for that is October is the time where the taxes are collected. So on top of everything else going on, there is no bread. Now you're saying, oh, by the way, you owe the money that you have for the last half of the year. So not great conditions to be dealing with at this point. The women start in Paris. They actually storm the Hotel de Ville and they ransack it. And the National Guards who are there, Lafayette's currently away at this point, but the National Guards who are there, they're not going to shoot into a crowd of women no matter how angry they are. And so they kind of let the women do their thing. They run through, they're about to kind of bring down destruction. Then the women get together and a voice kind of guides them and says, you know, our deal isn't with necessarily the people of Paris, it's with the king himself. Let's go to Versailles. So they make their way out. This is right around 10 a.m. So they're going to make it to Versailles by like 8 p.m., 9 p.m., that time frame. Traveling along the way, gathering more women along the road. Again, 60 to 70,000. This is not a small, insignificant number of women. These women themselves are not from the upper class of society. These are your third estate women. The one source that I read described them in modern parlance as rough around the edges. And I think that that's a nice way to describe the women as being hardy in nature, much different than kind of a noble woman might be. The National Guard's waiting there. Lafayette makes his way back. He gets there around 1, and the National Guard's like, dude, these women are going up there. And Lafayette initially is like, oh, well, you know, we better go. And the National Guard says, yeah, we told you that, but we're not going to stop them. We're going to join them. And so we're seeing a turn between the National Guard's allegiance. And Lafayette, rightly reading the writing on the wall here, says, oh, yeah, totally. Let's go and join them and see if we can work this out. In the meantime, he sends a rider up to Versailles in order to try and beat the women there so that they can alert the royal family and the Austrian guards who are stationed there as to what is going on. There are a couple of problems as the Austrian guards arrive at Versailles a week or so prior. There's an issue that gets reported in the paper that the cockade, this symbol down here, worn by these French revolutionaries, is one of the guards takes it and stomps on it and kind of this symbolic threat against the revolution. And so you have that going on. Louis has been given the Constitution from the National Assembly and has promised to sign it, but still has not signed it, and actually kind of sent it back and said, oh, by the way, here are some changes that I would make. And the National Assembly's like, dude, you agreed to sign off on this. That wasn't the deal. So that, the underlying conspiracy that's going on, all of that's happening at the same time that these women show up. Just a couple of quick notes about the cockade. Originally, they were green, but this was also the color of, I believe it was the Comte d'Artois, who was an enemy of the revolution at this point and a true monarchist in nature. And so they changed it to the red and blue of Paris. Eventually, the white is added as symbolic of the Bourbon family. Again, these people aren't necessarily looking to get rid of the king. They're looking for a constitutional monarchy at this point. Anyway, all that's going on. The women show up. They storm the castle gates. They have a sympathizer inside who's able to unlock the gates for them. They charge through. They're charging through the palace, frightening people left and right. They actually kill 2 of the Austrian guards. They saw the head off of one of them and are carrying it around on a pike outside. As this is all happening, Marie Antoinette is trying to get from her room into the king's room. The king has left to go get his children, so he's not in there. She's frantically pounding on the door of this secret passageway to make her way in there. Just an absolutely frightening experience. Eventually, the king gets back into his room, joined by Marie Antoinette, joined by a couple of loyal National Guardsmen and Austrian guards. Eventually, Lafayette is able to force his way past. These guards are able to push the women out of the palace, and they're now camped out outside. Very terrible conditions. It's been raining all day. They've traveled, 20 miles or whatever it is to get to Versailles. And Lafayette basically tells him at this point, dude, you're really going to have to make some changes. You're going to have to speak to these people, and you're going to have to agree to a lot of these demands. So the next morning, he heads out onto the balcony. He's cheered. Even his wife, Marie Antoinette, who's the symbol of a lot of the vitriol that these women are spitting because, again, she's an Austrian. She's not a true member of France, and she's going to convert us into some Protestant grouping again. And all of that's going on. She's actually kind of cheered as well. But he heads out onto the balcony. And he says, hey, listen, I'm totally going to sign the Constitution. I'll do it right now. He pins the cockade on Lafayette as a symbolic way to show that he is a member of the revolution. And he says, and we will head back to Paris. We will be closer. We will not be apart, this noble family. I am, in fact, the king of the French, not the king of France. And this is kind of symbolic wording, the idea that it's the people who give him this power. Now, the next day, so October the 6th, Louis and his family are going to head back to Paris. That's the last time that his family will ever be at Versailles. You have kind of some guards stationed just to make sure there aren't any looters, but it will no longer be this symbol of absolutism that it once stood for under Louis XIV, the Sun King. As we see the winter of 1789 kick in, we start to see the rise of the Jacobean Club, these political parties that are being used. The Jacobins, a little bit more revolutionary in nature. Publications, Andre Marat is going to be kind of the lead propagandist from a newspaper's perspective, going to be spreading the word of the Jacobins. And the Jacobean Clubs, they're going to form, at its height, over 500,000 Jacobins across France. And they form these political clubs all over the nation. So now this is no longer just a Parisian thing. Now this is spreading to other elements of France. Couple of other kind of quick things to note here. I don't know that Louis was the women who are bringing him back at this point. I don't know that they think, oh, like Louis made a choice to do this. They're kind of watching him on his way back to make sure he does make his way back there. So you have those elements entering into all of this as well. So as these Jacobin clubs form, they actually form into two factions, the Montagnards and the Girondins. They are both Republican in nature. The Jacobin clubs, they want to get rid of the monarchy, or they want a very, very strict constitutional monarchy, emphasis on constitution there. They are in opposition to this idea of a monarchy in any way. They're called the Jacobin Club because you see they end up at this abbey of Saint-Jacques, and so that's where we get the name Jacobin. Now, interestingly enough, the partisanship that develops after the return to Paris is actually because of that return to Paris. Now, this is going a little bit deep here, but when these men, mostly bourgeoisie, are going to make their way into Versailles, they're probably staying with people from their same geographic region. What does that mean? Well, you have this nice general cross-section of society. So you have some people who fall on one side of the spectrum, some on the other. But you are able to have disagreements, and the lodgings are based on geography. Now, as people move back to Paris, because the king is now back in Paris, the National Assembly is going to be meeting there as well. Now we start to see, okay, well, here are these people whose political ideologies I link up with. You guys have anywhere to stay? No, not us. Let's find somewhere to stay together. So you actually see a lot of polarization between political groupings as this move to Paris happens, because these people are staying with like-minded individuals. And what does that mean? Generally, when we isolate ourselves within one political grouping, that's going to lead to even more staunch views. That means you're much less likely to compromise because all you're hearing is from people who agree with you. The place where the National Assembly is going to meet is, you want to picture like a big theater, and people who are like-minded and are more radical in nature are going to sit with their friends, and people who are more conservative in nature are going to sit with their friends. And believe it or not, the terms of the political spectrum, left and right, come out of this time period, because the people who are more liberal in nature, at this point more radical in nature, they actually sit on the left side of this theater. The people who are more conservative sit on the right side, and that's how we end up with these terms themselves. As we see the Jacobins begin to split in Montagnards and Girondins, the Montagnards are known as the Mountain because they sit in the upper reaches of this theater, and so that's how they get that nickname. We don't need to go too far into the differences politically from each one of them. We can kind of take a much more cursory view. So what's going on in the rest of Europe as all of this happens? Well, everybody else is kind of watching this and giggling, because here are the mighty Bourbons, the mighty French Bourbons, and they are being brought to their knees by a group of 60,000 angry women who charge the gates of Versailles. And so everybody's kind of giggling. But as France takes a turn towards more radical views, this puts everybody on edge. These are mostly other monarchies strewn across Europe, and the feeling is, if these revolutionary ideas spread to their nation, who's to say they're not next? And so that's where we end up in 1791 with the Declaration of Pillnitz. This is where the Holy Roman Empire and Prussia expressed their support for Louis XVI. And eventually that goes one step further with what is known as the Brunswick Manifesto. And the Brunswick Manifesto says, if the king and his family are harmed, that will result in war. And we're going to see that that's going to be one of the main catalysts for the wars that are going to occur. Here you have this nice political cartoon. You can see down here what this nice gentleman is doing with the Brunswick Manifesto to show you what the French people thought of this declaration. The French people, again, your more revolutionary factions, are going to start to say, what business do you have in this affair? And so that brings us to the French Revolutionary Wars, 1792 to 1801. There are a variety of them through this time period. Prussia, Austria, England are going to feature prominently. We have these different groupings called coalitions, and there are like 7 different coalitions throughout these different wars. These tended to be smaller armies, more experienced, they're professionals, they're hired mercenaries. But a big idea from this time period, a turning point, is going to come from France, where we see a larger army, the levée en masse, that we get to here, where it's basically kind of universal conscription for French soldiers. They are drafted or volunteer. They are patriotic. They are not formed because they are paid for it, but because they believe in the ideals of what it means to be French. This patriotic, nationalistic fervor that is beginning to rise up in France is going to be different than ever before. And it's really going to form what we're going to see with armies moving forward from this point. And the ideas of nationalism are what are going to eventually help lead to World War I, as these people are rising up and we are fighting for our nation, we are fighting for our people. We see September Massacre as basically getting rid of the old guard within the French army so that it's much more of a meritocracy. Initially, this starts out very, very poorly for France. You can see the map here. People are getting pushed into France, in some cases within sight of Paris, but eventually we see France begin to make inroads into different areas. We see them actually capture the Austrian Netherlands. We see them move into northern Italy against the Austrians, begin to take their territory. And that's where Napoleon in the late 1700s is really going to cut his teeth as a general, as he moves through the Alps and into northern Italy. And here's where we start to take a turn towards Radical Town. I'm going to stop this video here and then continue in the next set just so that we can have some continuity.